Hi, this is Professor Chad McGuire, and welcome to our final subject area in discussing ocean policy and law issues. And this is offshore jurisdictional issues, international law considerations. By way of introduction and overview, we can identify a few things, bringing forward everything that we've learned thus far in the course. One of the important things that we can think about that's been discussed earlier, but we can reiterate now, is that as we move offshore, we have unique policy issues that have been identified. So anytime, even if we're within a nation, a coastal nation, let's say, or a coastal state, as we begin to move offshore, the way in which we treat offshore areas and offshore resources, the things that are found in the waters as we move offshore, is different in many ways than how we treat geophysical locations that are on our shore and the things that we find there. Now, in this lecture, we're discussing materials really where we move to the point of not just within the nation's jurisdiction, but now jurisdictions between nations, what we call sort of open seas or areas beyond our 200 miles / continental shelf, just some geophysical characteristics. But at some point, usually it's 200 miles and beyond 200 miles, international waters. But even without discussing those international waters, even when we're still talking about areas that within a nation's jurisdiction in part, we're talking about how countries interact with one another when it comes to how they use ocean areas and resources, not only their own, but others, and to what extent that they have the rights to use other resources and what limitations might exist. So when I say that moving offshore creates its own set of unique policy issues, most of those issues surround well-defined or, in some cases, ill-defined property rights. And what I mean by that is, if we start moving offshore and we start thinking about the things that exist within it and even the locations, the less that we have an agreement about what are defined sort of geophysical areas, for example, like who owns what, who controls the space in this ocean water from let's say some demarcated point to some other point as we move offshore. Who controls that space? And then what does it mean to control that space? Does that mean you can control it like a private property owner? Can a country, for example, exclude any other country from entering that space for any reason whatsoever? Much like it can control its own land. You think of borders, for example, here in the United States, we share a main border with two countries, Canada and Mexico. And we can think about, what it means to have those physical borders on land and what it means to control the movement of things and people from those areas. And you can think about this from wherever you are in terms of those sort of geophysical borders on land. Now, as we start moving offshore, we can think about those same sort of issues, but we can understand it's a little more complicated because those property rights often are not super well defined or agreed upon even between, let's say, countries. Now, that might not be the case when we're talking about near shore, like if you're within a certain close proximity to the nation. Most countries understand that the closer I get to another country's, coastal area, like the land that abuts the water, the more that I'm getting into their space. But the further I'm away from that area, it's a little more complicated. Does that country have the right to prevent me from moving in that area? Does it have control over the resources within that area? And even if it does, do I, as the other country, do I have a right to sort of identify an area that's outside of what we would agree is the private ocean property, and then access resources from that space including resources that are mobile, for example, that move from maybe what I would consider to be the other countries, personal property because of where they're located to this other area. So you think of birds, for example. You see a bird here again in the United States, in New England, where I'm from. And this happens a lot, but we have Canadian geese. We call them Canadian geese. They come down here and fly into America and transit cross-border between Canada and the United States, and even further, going to Mexico even, or monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies in the winter months come up into New England and even further north, and then they travel as the fall comes and the colder weather comes into our area of the world, and they start traveling south towards Mexico. And we understand that these animals cross borders. And when they do, national borders. And when they do, there's a change maybe in their, so if I'm a bird hunter, let's say, for example, and I hunt geese, and let's say it's okay to hunt geese, and I have a license to hunt geese, and there's plenty of geese. If that goose is in Canada's territory, I have no right to hunt that goose if I'm in the United States. But the moment that goose moves over the border between Canada and the United States, now maybe, depending on if my license is a federal license or a state license, if it comes within the jurisdiction where I have the right to take it, then I can. And so we have this understanding, this principle, this general principle, and this is relatively well accepted as a sort of, let's call it a norm, not a complete global norm, but a relatively, let's say, norm that, the right to, take these things, whether they be animals or, other things, are related to location. I mean, we even have this in American law here in most states in the United States. For example, if you think of private property, you have a house and a piece of land, and it abuts another property. There might be a tree that sits on one property, but then its branches extend into the other's property. That tree is owned by the landowner who owns the property in which the trunk of the tree is located. So the tree is private property, and it's owned by the landowner who owns the land in which the tree exists. But the branches that extend over into the other landowner's property, those branches are subject to being, manipulated by that other landowner. Even though that other landowner doesn't own the tree, it has a right to trim, let's say, those branches to, that move over into the space of the abutting landowner. And one of the reasons, because we have a sort of a norm that's been, sort of formalized here under common law doctrine, and even into, let's say, civil code in many states, where the landowner owns not only the land, but the airspace. So if you own, a latitude and longitude, a square you can identify as your land, you own what's beneath it and what's above it as well, for the most part. And so you can think of that also in relationship to the ocean, where we create this sort of X, Y, and Z, so a three-dimensional sort of space. And it's the airspace above the ocean, and it's it's the water space below the surface of the water, all the way down to the sea bottom, and then even maybe what's below the sea bottom, if you can think of that, to the crust, and even maybe further. But to the point being, for all intents and purposes, just all that's above and all that's below, to a degree, because we're a globe. And you can imagine, if we keep going through, you're hitting land. You can't go all the way through, because you're hitting land that's on the other side of the earth relative to where you are. But anyway, hopefully you get the point that there's some property rights are really important in identifying and setting forward these frameworks. Now, we talked about this earlier regarding the United States and some of the coastal states relative to federalism. So the federal government and coastal states' rights and how they interact. So we got a taste of how property rights really help understand those interactions and set the stage for really important policy development. And we talked about it under the Submerged Land Act, as we got more defined property rights in the 1950s, federal government, who controls resources, even within what we'd consider state coastal waters. And then the Submerged Land Act, formalizing that, coastal states have the right to these resources, these things that are found within 3 miles of the low water mark. And then we had the Coastal Zone Management Act, 1972, which then gave further policy definition and rights and obligations between the federal and coastal states. Well, here we're talking about countries, between countries for the most part. And the more that we can have agreed upon norms and even defined agreed upon rights beyond norms, it helps us. It helps in the same way it helps us set the stage for sort of the rules of the road, the way in which countries can interact with one another when it comes to these kind of rights. So what's important to identify, or at least reiterate here, I think I brought it up a little bit, at least indirectly, is that property rights apply to both the physical areas, right? That sort of X, Y, and Z space, the latitude and longitude, as well as things, both living and non-living things. So you can think of living things like fish and other thing and marine mammals and so on and so forth that might move between these sort of boundaries, these latitude and longitudes, because they are mobile species, right? And non-living things that we can think of that are the things that we talked about: oil and gas, certainly offshore oil and gas drilling, polymetallic nodules, these other sort of important things that are sitting at the bottom that contain rare earth metals and that sort of thing that are on the bottom of the ocean, and that can include ocean and state waters and national waters and in international waters. And you get storms, you get riling, and if it's deep enough, if that storm has activity that's deep enough, we're not talking about the deep sea where really not much movement happens too often, and you can imagine in areas where there's enough turbidity and volume that you can get some movement of that ocean water, which can then move some of these non-living resources. They can move them distance through some physical forces of nature. And of course, both living and non-living things can move from, like I said, one area to another. So they can move from, let's say, an agreed upon norm, property right jurisdiction of coastal nation A to coastal nation B, for example. This often happens. And nations are sovereigns. An important point here is that each nation is a sovereign, and that kind of sovereignty is not the same as what we've already described as the United States or federal and coastal state relationships. So states here in the United States are sovereigns, but they're under a special relationship with the federal government. That special relationship makes them sovereigns to a degree, but not complete sovereigns. Nation states, the United States versus Canada versus Mexico, just sticking here in sort of the North America region, in terms of all coastal nations, right? They're separate, unique sovereigns from one another now, even though they might have certain agreements, like we have NAFTA and whatever the acronym to the more recent iteration of it is. We have these international agreements or even bilateral, trilateral agreements, not necessarily international, but between nations that allow us to have some formal rules of the road for a number of things. What I'm talking about is trade mostly, but there's other things that sort of formalize relationships. It's not the same. It's not the same as maybe the EU the European Union as a better example of federalism between countries and some overarching sort of, agreed upon superseding a government for a number of reasons. That might be a better analog, not a complete analog to the United States and the states within the federal government versus the states. The EU might be somewhat of an analog, but for the most part, nations are sovereigns in a way that is different, particularly coastal nations, than what we've already described regarding the federal government and coastal states. That's important to know because they are true sovereigns from one another. So it's very difficult. It's harder to get coastal nations to agree on rules regarding ocean resources. It's really difficult to do this in many cases because of that sovereignty. And that sovereignty is incredibly important. for each of these nations. They get to make their own choices about what they do. But of course, without an agreement about how we interact in these common spaces, or or even, what's yours versus what's mine, or look, your rights extend to this space and time as my rights do, or to this general limit of space. It's without these kind of rules, these hard set rules, it's really hard to create any policy. And that's just so when there is agreement, it is generally by consensus between these nations, which means lots of compromise and thus less strict in meeting defined policy goals. So what we should expect is, because of this difficulty, is that when we look at how coastal nations, when we start moving far offshore from each of the coastal nations, and we think about the areas that might be shared between coastal nations, it's much harder to get these nations to agree to hard, fast rules, equally, that are applied equally between the nations. And as a result of that, if we're thinking about it from a policy standpoint, any policies that do exist between these nations are going to be based on a lot of compromise, because there's a lot of different interests at stake. And it's hard to get everyone, all different coastal nations across the globe, to agree upon certain principles. And as a result of that, you might have an ideal at the beginning, like it would be great if everybody agreed upon these 10 things equally, but at the end, in order to get everybody to agree somewhat, that ideal is far from met. And often we find this in international accords, agreements, and so you'll see this and including Unclos, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, and you'll see that convention has really good sort of basic frameworks, but there's a lot of space in between where some of these property rights are not super well defined, or they're not equally followed, and that sort of thing. So that's important to know. Really quickly, for those of you that are watching this for the first time, this will be new for you, but for those of you that have watched some of the other video lectures and gotten into this material, you'll remember this or recall our sort of property right characteristics. And so we have a representation here of property rights, the different categories of property rights based on two criteria, excludability and divisibility, or two characteristics of property rights. And through these two, we can move down here really quick, excuse me. Let me turn on laser pointer. Through divisibility and excludability, we can discern the major ways we categorize physical things as property. So we can think about, for example, in US waters, for example, we have something that is like, again, we have something that's mobile, like a marine mammal or a fish, something that's physical and mobile and can move between areas. And we can think about how, for example, let's say it's a marine mammal, is within US jurisdiction, is owned by the United States, quote unquote owned, while it is physically present in US waters. But if that mammal moves outside of, think of a dolphin, for example, if that mammal moves outside of US waters, it is no longer owned by the United States. The effect of this change in ownership by the circumstance of physical location creates policy issues that need to be considered. For example, if the US has a policy of protecting marine mammals within its borders, we call it the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We have a federal law in the United States, and that is, a policy that's legitimized by the passage of that law, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Then that policy is frustrated when the mammals move outside of US jurisdiction, because the rules of ownership have changed based on other rules regarding jurisdictional limits. In this way, the rules regarding jurisdiction impact other rules for the protection of marine resources. And the common factor affecting both the protection rule and the jurisdictional rule is physical location. So another example, including property rights and rules established for transferring those property rights within a jurisdiction. Commercial fishing licenses in the United States are created by government as a way of realizing direct economic utility of certain marine resources like fish and scallops. So we have what we call, target species, things that we think are commercially viable. There's going to be a market for it. There's a lot of demand. And these are things that exist in US waters, for example. The property right of the resource, while in U.S. jurisdiction, is that of a public resource. So something we'd call a public good, maybe, right? So it's owned by the government. It's not an ideal, it's not a complete public good. It's more probably a common pool resource, but without getting into the details because of its divisibility, the question of how divisible they are, which they are highly divisible. But we'll just call it a public good or a public resource. So as a public resource, the government grants the right to certain private individuals, in the United States at least, to capture the resource under their own efforts. And upon the act of capturing the fish, ownership transfers from the public to the private individual. The resource becomes the private property of the individual fisher. The legitimacy of this act is wholly based on a common factor, physical location. Only so long as the resource is in the jurisdiction of the United States is the ownership right controlled by the United States. So make this a better example here. We'll move beyond this. And so, for example, well, we can use that. So only so long as the resource is in the control, if the fish moves outside of U.S. jurisdiction, then the ability of the U.S. to assign the property right to a private commercial fisher no longer exists. So, for example, if the fisher captured the fish in another country's jurisdiction, then they could not claim a legal right of ownership over the fish based on U.S. law. Here's how we can look at this between physical location and the idea of property rights and how they might change based on where the thing is identified and where it is captured. The point being made regarding the fish in the United States is that anything that exists in US waters, as has been previously explained, is a public good. We allow for those public goods to be put to some use, and we have an overlay, a general overlay of capitalism. Sort of market incentives and that sort of thing. So what we usually do is, instead of the US having a publicly supported fishing fleet, a publicly managed, a publicly sourced fishing fleet, we have private commercial fishing fleets. And what we do is we often hold auctions. And in these auctions, we give rights, licenses. And there's a number of ways that it's done. It's done different in different parts of the United States, but we generally give a right to private individuals, companies, individual fishermen, that sort of thing, to go out and capture X amount of fish. And that amount is determined based on a whole history. There's a whole sort of complicated process of determining what is the, what is what we believe to be, the actual population size of and under other dynamics about, natural losses, so on and so forth, other pressures, fecundity rates, viability, how many young are going to be produced, how many are going to survive to adulthood. The point is, a very complicated calculation goes on to do an assessment of the stock of the target species. And then from that assessment, we determine how much can be taken in each year without harming the underlying stock, without harming the species to the point where it actually starts declining in its population or gets threatened in any way. And so we go through this calculation, and based on that calculation, we come up with a number. And through that number, we provide an opportunity for private fishermen based on a number of different ways of getting these licenses. But once they have these licenses, they now engage in their own efforts to go out under their own, they pay for their own fishing gear, their own, fishing boats, their own people to help do the fishing. They choose the time depending on other limitations. They go out there and they engage in effort and they capture the fish. And upon capturing the fish, the moment that they take that fish out of the water, it now transfers. Its property right transfers from a public resource to a private resource the moment that they capture it. And the idea there is that, look, this fish has a life cycle. It's going to die. This certainly happens with scallops, for example. We've come to realize that many targets, like sea scallops, the larger scallops in the United States waters, the males at least, they are capable of reproducing for a number of years, and then they live for a number of years after they're really done reproducing. And that's usually what you look for in sort of the target areas, this scallop resource that undoubtedly has other values beyond just reproduction in the ecosystem. But the idea is there we're not affecting their ability, the overall scallop population, for targeting scallops that are at their or after their normal sort of reproduction stage. And then we look for them and we go and try to find where they're located and try to focus on them to a degree. And that helps to, ensure. But the point is, we're trying to utilize a resource, a valuable resource that otherwise will simply die and won't have any, direct human use for consumptive purposes, at least once that occurs. So we want to incentivize, some of that, the getting. Now, here I have an example to put this into clarification. So here, let's say we have an oil deposit, and this oil deposit exists in this area between an exclusive economic zone and international waters right here, right? So it's part of, let's call this is a delineation of, we know that, and we'll get into this in a little bit about, who owns what, but we'll say that the coastal nation owns any resource up to here. And then international waters are, well, international waters, and there's really no single nation that owns a right. So think about the idea that access, any other entity could, let's say conceivably, any other coastal, including this nation, the coastal nation here, but coastal nation A, let's say, is the one that owns, the resources up to here, and then any other coastal nation, including coastal nation A, can take advantage of any of resources here without any other rules, without any other agreed upon rules, because of the whole sovereignty and everything. Let's just put all those agreed upon rules aside. So we say the coastal state nation A, the one that wants to develop this oil field and wants to establish an oil rig here, but lo and behold, another coastal state wants to also establish this oil field and start drilling and start yielding from this. And the question is, who has the right to these resources? Well, without any hard rules, both actually have a right to the resource, and it's sort of a race in time. It's like, who can get to it faster? If anybody's ever seen, was it Wes Anderson's There Will Be Blood, I think in 2007 or so, with Daniel Day-Lewis. It's a really good sort of historical discussion about, or at least representation about some of the early days of oil prospecting in the United States, once oil was discovered as a viable resource terrestrially. And well, if you know anything about that movie and you watch the character, you'll understand that location and sort of timing is everything. So the notion is that, look, if I can access this oil deposit from a location, I'm legally entitled to access it, even if it overlaps to somebody else's property. As long as I can access it in my area, then I can sort of drain it, first in time. Otherwise, if everything else is okay, then I have an equal right to it. It's not that I can't remove the oil deposit simply because part of it sits on your land or in your jurisdiction. It's just, as long as I can access it legally, then I can take as much as I want, or all of it, if I can do it before you. So you can see how this can create an inherent conflict. And this not only exists with things like oil and gas, which are relatively stable and sort of sit. So if you have these deposits that are, that are within two jurisdictions or straddle jurisdiction, we also know that we call these highly transitory species or highly migratory species. We have these, of course, and there's the codfish, for example, because cod has been such a hallmark species, at least here in the sort of North Atlantic waters of the United States, but also in others as well. But these species don't stay in one particular area necessarily. Not that cod is an example of a highly migratory, but not that they're not either. But the point is, you can have fish species that also move between these zones, and you can develop all kinds of difficulties. You can imagine an example where, I know in New England, for example, and the cod have been, relatively speaking, overfished, and so there have been rules put in place, that limitations. So in order to protect the remaining population and hopefully allow it to sort of redevelop itself to healthy population numbers, so you can re-establish the fishery, there's been a no-take. There's been a prohibition on fishing cod for a significant amount of time in the United States. Now, one of the difficulties with having that kind of prohibition is that if adult cod, for example, that you're protecting and not allowing to be taken, move between the United States jurisdiction and, let's say, Canada's jurisdiction, and Canada has no such rule, then, some would argue that you're in a situation where you're limiting your own ability to capture these fish, and all you're doing is allowing them to grow and develop and then move over into another jurisdiction, whether that's Canadian or international waters, where there might be fishers sitting there from other countries in the international waters, or Canadian fishermen in Canadian waters waiting for these fish to move over. And we call them spillover effects, but where they're just allowing, they're taking this fish. So all you're doing with that policy is you're not achieving the ultimate goal of actually rebounding the species necessarily. You're just limiting your take of that species while it's in your jurisdiction. The moment it moves over into another jurisdiction, it's taken by other actors. So you can see the inherent difficulty here, where if you do not have an agreement between all actors, whether that's a bilateral agreement with another country that borders you, or an international agreement with all other potential actors that might want to come over and sit in international waters just beyond your boundary and wait for commercially valuable species to move over, fish here and capture what they can capture, including those that are moving over the line, so to speak. So if you don't have these hard, fast rules, then you can see how we can create what effectively is a tragedy of the commons, a traditional sort of tragedy of the commons, where if you don't have limited access, if you don't have hard rules and regulations, then you fall into that trap, including under our property right characteristic before, the common pool resource, which Eleanor Ostrom so well identified. Where effectively, if you're not highly regulated, and if you're not the divisibility of these resources, the limits of these resources, provides the opportunity for this sort of Garrett Hardin tragedy of the commons, where you overfish or you take too much of natural resources, because if you don't use it, if you don't take it, somebody else will. And even nationally, if you think about that, without the other players, whether that's again a country next to you or other countries, if they're not playing by the kind of rules that you're developing for yourself, if they're not agreeing, then it incentivizes you not to create those rules. So even if you want to protect the fish species, the idea that the protection will be ultimately futile simply incentivizes you to take the fish while they exist, even if you know they're already overfished, because having something is better than nothing if they're going to be continually overfished anyway by other actors that you cannot control because they're outside of your property jurisdiction. That is the, again, tragedy of the commons, race to the bottom. So it can often lead to a lack of defined agreement and property rights between all actors in a situation, can lead to sort of this race to the bottom, where policies are, even though they're preferred, they're not followed by the states that would, the nation states that would prefer those policies. They actually reject them simply because of the effect. And so that's something to consider. And by the way, it's not only fish, it's also dolphins and other, like the marine mammals, for example. So here we can have a historical perspective. And in this historical perspective, one of the things that I'm focusing on for us to consider is technology. And the reason why is because technology has been such an important part of us moving offshore. And so let's try to put this into a little bit of context. So in our earlier discussion about offshore resources in the United States, we talked about the discovery of oil and other marine resources that began what we call the tideland controversy between the United States and coastal states like California. Much of the driving force behind that controversy between ownership rights of coastal resources was technological development. As technology allowed for marine resources to be reached and extracted, the value of those resources began to be realized, particularly the direct economic value of the resource. Therefore, the desire to capture the value created competition for the resource that, for the most part, did not exist prior to technology realizing this value. In this way, we can see how technology can be a powerful force that creates new problems requiring policy development. The technological capacity to extract the resources and the corresponding economic benefits created the ownership conflict between state and federal government requiring policy solutions, ultimately the Submerged Lands Act in 1953, to resolve the dispute. So what we're saying here is that technology in many ways creates the sort of impetus for us to start thinking about creating property rights in our oceans, because without technological advancement, we really don't have a need or a use for rules to the road, because there's no human interaction. There's very limited human interaction in those areas. And so if we can't go below the surface of our near waters You think about early oil and gas development offshore. We could really just do it right near shore is the best we could do before. And we didn't even think about it before we realized oil was something that we wanted, that we could then take and use as an input for energy production and for a number of other uses. And oil, meaning oil stored in the ground, whether that's terrestrially or offshore, near shore. And so the tidelands controversy was about us really realizing that we could extract this oil. Well, first of all, that the oil was useful. It was useful for a number of human uses, including energy production. And after that realization, the idea that we could access it, that it existed in these nearshore waters, but we could access it and we could actually take it out of those waters. We had the capacity to do that, but it was very limited. So you can think about, wow, it's really important to start developing rules near shore in order to understand, who has the rights to these resources. It's the fact that before we could access it, it's not a resource. Think about that. It just isn't something we would consider a resource until we have a means to use it. For most of our history, I think about lithium right now, at least in lithium-ion batteries. Lithium has become an incredibly important rare earth element globally because of our technological advancement, and the desire for much of our technologies require lithium as an input, whether that's chip manufacturing or battery manufacturing. But for most of human history, lithium, who cares, right? Lithium doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to us because it doesn't really do anything for us. We don't have a viable use. So it's not considered a resource necessarily. It's not something that we're targeting. It's not something we're looking for. And we can think about this in many contexts. We think about target fish species historically. There were many fish in the process of catching the fish that we wanted. We caught many other fish, and we call those, that was bycatch. That was fish we didn't care about, fish we didn't want. We threw it overboard. If it came from deep below, we had killed it because we dragged them up too fast. And so, their air bladders or other things, depending on the type of fish and the species, we would harm them physically. The point is we just got rid of them. They were trash. But they're incredibly, as the target fish species, as we overfished a number of target fish species here in the United States, but elsewhere as well, we start looking at these other fish as viable substitutes, that they actually start using these fish as a means of, satisfying our demand for fish. So, oh, is this a good fish? How does it cook? Does it taste good? That sort of thing. It's like, oh, geez, this is a really good fish. Monkfish is one example. Lobsters, historically, lobsters were considered trash early on. They were considered a poor man's meal. And now, of course, lobsters are incredibly valuable and they're a high demand globally for lobsters. So the point is, hopefully you can understand that as technology changes, as preferences adapt, that sort of thing, we can see things as resources that were not resources before. But most importantly, thinking about how over time, we started moving from land to ocean, but that movement isn't ubiquitous. We didn't move from, start near shore to, international waters, something beyond 200 miles out to sea, because we had no real capacity to even access those areas for most of human civilization or most of human history. So historically, we can start like around 1000 AD, and this is mostly in Western, but we can think about it globally, that we think limited capacities, right? We had limited capacities for ocean faring. Early ocean travelers, examples, Macedonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Vikings, etc., all use small water vessels to move about the coastline. And they, for the most part, stuck really close to the coastlines. Sometimes they moved over. I know we have Atlantic crossings, that sort of thing. And we also have a number of Mediterranean and certainly in the East, there are a number of examples, but for the most part, whether it's Persia, ancient China and many others and their capacity, maritime capacities. But for the most part, they were limited. We were not about going far out into open seas and traveling throughout, long periods. So we think about those small water vessels and moving about the coastline. It was only more recently in human history that larger ocean vessels were developed and humans began to move further offshore along the open oceans for exploration, transit, and ultimately resource exploitation. Early Western discussions, and we're focusing because we're dealing mostly with ocean policy and law derived from, sort of Western traditions here. But early Western discussions about the ownership of the open ocean came about from the Dutch, who had been using sea routes to develop trade with the East. To ensure these routes would remain open for commerce purposes, Dutch legal scholars argued for something they called mare liberum, or the freedom of the seas. The concept argued that oceans should remain open for transit purposes of all countries to encourage commerce and help develop the wealth of nations. At this time, the seas were seen mainly as highways, meaning the value was in accessing the open oceans for transit and not for the exploitation of resources that existed within the water of the open ocean itself. So as we move, from the 1000 AD to say the 1500s, 14, 15, 16, 1700s, our ability in that second half of that millennium to start transiting larger areas, and we started engaging in the Dutch East India Company, for example, but we started engaging in commerce, and this commerce had, global. We started a version of sort of global trade. And again, oceans were seen as a highway, as a mechanism. So these boats would go and they would, identify items of value. And there's a whole history. There's some terrible parts of this history. It's the precursors for colonialism and some others in terms of taking advantage of people that live in another place in order to make things that can then be extracted, sort of an extractive economy, where you take the things from that other area and bring it back to the to where you want them to be, where you can gain value from them. But it's mostly about taking resources and items and things from one place and bringing them back to another to make that other area more wealthy. So there's a lot wrapped up in this history. But putting that aside for the moment and just thinking about the idea, the notion of, well, let's use oceans for, what are we using them for? What are they important for? They're important for transit. So let's keep them open because transit's important. And you can see the self-interest in this, and you can see that it's like, well, we shouldn't have nations that are, with private property rights that extend pretty far out to the oceans, because we want to make sure that that boats and companies and, can travel. And of course, who has the technology to travel these distances? The ones that are trying to make the rules. They have the vested interest, but still. So we have this notion of freedom of the seas, mare liberum. And the concept is we keep these places open so that we can incentivize trade and incentivize, commerce, sort of early iterations of capitalism in terms of free markets, that kind of thing, or not super free markets, but at least in terms of the resources and the utilization and bringing back the resources through private enterprise, that kind of thing. So further technological advancement brought forth a more refined interpretation of mare liberum. So as time went on, we had more technological advancement, and then it's like, well, what does freedom of the seas really mean here? Or precisely just how free transit over the ocean should be. As ocean vessels became warships, so we think about this, think about those large ships there as we start moving into the 1700s and these cannons, multiple cannon ships, that sort of thing, again, in sort of mostly Western Europe, mostly. But anyway, as the vessels became warships armed with cannon and used militarily to advance national interests abroad, the ideas behind complete freedom of transit were refined. The cannon shot rule was developed, Thomas Jefferson was a proponent, in the late 1700s as a means of defining the sovereign territory of a coastal state. At the time, a cannon fired from an ocean vessel could travel approximately 3 miles. Thus, the cannon shot rule suggested no ship could travel within 3 miles of a coastal state without the express permission of that nation. The 3 miles from the land was the sovereign territory of the nation. So if anybody ever wanted to know why that state waters 3 miles has become sort of a standard, we talked about this in US jurisdiction, but we'll also see under Unclos. That effectively comes from the cannon shot rule. This idea that, look, you need to have, I understand that mare liberum and transit is important, but it allows for these ships to get pretty close to our coastal areas, and the ships are no longer just about moving things. Now they have, now they have some sort of malintent. They have the capacity to do harm. So if they're within 3 miles, they can shoot upon, our coastal fortifications, our coastal habitation. So now we need to start moving out. So no complete freedom of the seas. Now we start to have private ownership. So we can see that the cannon shot rule is important in not only defining a 3 mile limit of sovereignty as a first expression of sovereignty in ocean waters, not just for a particular nation, but generally as a general concept of limiting mare liberum or freedom of the seas. freedom of navigation. So we have this 3-mile limit, but it also starts incorporating not just that limitation, but the notion that we're starting to put further and further sovereignty limits on ocean areas. There are other examples of technology increasing the capacity of utilizing marine resources, whether that be the sea itself or things within the sea. As technology has increased capacity to interact with the ocean, coastal nations have developed rules to protect their respective interests in those ocean resources. Those nations who have the capacity to exploit resources generally favor the ability to exploit, while coastal nations that do not have the capacity to exploit or protect their coastal resources generally favor the protection of coastal resources. The divergence between advanced and developing coastal nations led to the need for an international agreement on these issues, and this has resulted in Unclos, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, over the past few decades. The results of Unclos, which are ongoing since 1982, are a set of generally applicable rules that are followed by most coastal nations today. So what we're saying here is that from 1700s, we have the cannon shot rule. In the 1900s, we can think of World War I and particularly World War II, and that had a huge influence, at least again in the West, but it had global repercussions, this influence. As you can think of submarines, the development of now mechanization, of boats, of large steel boats that can travel long distances, be out at sea for a long period of time and carry with them significant, significant amounts of technology. And certainly as we move into 1950s and further today, missiles even, right? We think of, again, this is an attenuation of this, the cannons of the boats, but now the boats become more sophisticated. We have submarines and other technological advancements as I'm moving along the axis here. And then we certainly now move into closer to today, where now we have ships that can fire missiles that are almost, and certainly submarines as well, nuclear armed submarines with intercontinental ballistic missiles, or close to that anyway, that can go for thousands of miles. So it's a really significant, and you can see how this technological advancement, not just from this military side, but has really advanced this notion of moving further and further out to sea, the rights limiting effectively the spaces that we call sort of commons, or where freedom of navigation is easy. And it's not just international water, you still have navigation. We'll get in that in a minute, but we can see this pressure as technology has advanced. And it's not just for that, for protection of the coastal state, but we can also see how that technology has allowed us to access resources further out to sea, the resources of that sea, oil and gas, marine resources, fisheries, etc., and even resources in what's called the deep seabed. The point is, those that have the technology have always been sort of, and the capacity to exploit resources have always been pro-exploit. And that includes limiting the ability, we want to have, it's a weird world where we want to protect our coastal waters and have sovereignty over our coastal spaces and our ocean spaces further and further out as time goes on. But we want to be able to access other ocean spaces for resources and limit the ability of other nations. So you can see this sort of strange juxtaposition, and other coastal nations that don't have all of that technological development are really pro-protection. They're pro about, because of course they don't want another country coming in and taking all of their valuable resources without them having anything, any way to protect themselves from it, any way to defend themselves from it. And so you can see there's a desire to set up rules, but there's a lot of conflicting interests in trying to set up those rules. So the main driver, if we look at it from a technology perspective, we can see many of the sort of how many of these issues have developed. And just quickly to bring back our original from an earlier lecture, we can see how what that leads to is again, where we have legal framework definitions that are really high for any given nation as we move into the land. But as we start moving out into the water, less and less legal framework definition, although it is increasing over time, more and more legal framework definition over time. There's more legal definition here than there was 50 years ago. There's more legal definition here than there was 50 years ago. So we're increasing our legal definition, but relative to what we have in our terrestrial areas, it's still fairly low, which means that there's a lot of policy options. And Unclos really is is this, in 1982, this desire to try to set up some sort of formalized international agreement of rule-based norms in order to establish some legal framework definition in these areas. And as a result of that, create some policy. Because there's a lot of, there's almost no policy environment out here, no rules of the road, so to speak. In terms of Unclos, we can just go over the jurisdictional zones, and this is helpful in understanding some of these. So let's just go over these jurisdictional zones that have been defined by Unclos since 1982. First of all, we have a baseline, and that baseline is established by the mean low water mark. That mean low water mark is where the average low water tide line exists at a particular location on a shoreline. It creates the baseline from all other zones. So wherever you are, we're taking the average low water mark, because remember, low tide can be affected by a number, moon phases, but a number of factors. So you might have a low tide, and sea level rise is changing this. So, but putting sea level rise aside for the moment, the idea is that our low tides are not always the same. So we take an average of the mean low water mark, and over a period of time, we take that average and we identify that in any given nation, any different area, as the baseline. And that's what Unclos says. And the United States, by the way, follows most of these. Even though the United States is not a signatory, it is not ratified, I should say. It's signatory, but it hasn't ratified. Unclos has not been ratified in the United States. It has to be ratified by Congress, and it has not. But we follow most of the dictates and norms established, and most of what we talked about already in terms of the United States zones, the zones in the United States, they follow these same sort of general rules, particularly in terms of the baseline. Our baseline is also the mean low water mark in the United States, but that's the baseline. And that says every country should have this as the baseline. Every signatory, this is how we establish your baseline, mean low water mark. The tidelands, something they define as the tidelands, that's established by the mean high water mark. Now, the tidelands are effectively the intertidal zone. It's the difference between the low tide and the high tide. That in low tide, it's, you can walk on it, sandy area most of the time, and in the high tide, it's covered by water. The territorial sea, again, all coming from that baseline. The territorial sea is 12 miles from the baseline. So it's the sovereign territory, but allows for innocent passage. So territorial sea extends to 12 miles. It does in the United States as well, because again, we follow these dictates or these policy prescriptions from Unclos. But what we're saying here is that the territorial sea, 12 miles from baseline, is the sovereign territory. So the country controls those 12 miles, and it controls it significantly, but it allows for the innocent passage of vessels from other countries. So you cannot prevent other countries. I mean, there are a number of examples, but using within 12 miles or using that area for, you can have more restrictive measures, significant restrictive measures about how countries utilize within 12 miles of your territorial sea. A lot of protections, but you should allow for what we call innocent passage. So passage that's not based on for commercial activities, for recreational activities from other countries, other flagged country vessels, but certainly research, for example, but not for malintent, negative intent. The contiguous zone, that's to 24 miles from the baseline. So it extends a further 12 miles out from the territorial sea. And that's where we have, it's not necessarily sovereign territory, but it's an enhanced security. So what we can see is we have the sort of diminishing sort of significant property right, or diminishing private property right. What we call in the contiguous zone, 24 miles, again, you have passage of other vessels. Other vessels have the right to freedom of the seas and freedom of navigation, but you can have enhanced security. So you can stop these vessels, these non-coastal state or non-coastal nation flag vessels, for customs, immigration, drug intervention, etc. Basically, they are allowed to be there. They can do many things, but you can check out what they're doing to make sure they're not doing anything illicit within the contiguous zone. The exclusive economic zone, that is usually 200 miles from a baseline, or the extent of the continental shelf. Sometimes the continental shelf, that is a geomorphology, a geomorphic sort of feature. Sometimes it can extend further. That's just for the resource extraction, because historically we've had the ability to access, the continental shelf is it's not the slope, but it's just, it's an area where we've had historically the ability to access the bottom of the shelf. But anyway, that area of the exclusive economic zone, however defined, usually it's 200 miles. Not many continental shelves extend beyond 200 miles, but some do for some coastal nations, but it's mostly 200 miles from that baseline. That the marine resource exclusivity means that the resources within that area are exclusive. And then the high seas. The high seas are the areas beyond the exclusive economic zone in international waters, and that's where mare liberum is at its that's where the freedom of the high seas, you know, that's where that notion it still sits true for everyone. There are no limitations on what, for the most part, and unless there's other agreements that nations agree to. But as far as Unclos is concerned, the high seas are these international waters where everybody has, relatively speaking, equal access. In addition, there's the deep seabed at the very bottom of usually international waters. And that's the area beyond the continental shelf. It's generally located in the high seas. And this is mostly about resource management of things that exist beyond national maritime boundaries. So this was a desire to say, look, we start thinking about the things that exist in the deep seabed, those polymetallic nodules that I've mentioned, for example. And as technology is advancing to the point where nations can extract, let's start thinking about rules of the road. Because look, if, again, a nation is more technologically advanced than another nation, then it has the capacity to go out and maybe access these things at the exclusion of those other nations. And so if we think about, so, you know, there is an argument that the high seas are like Antarctica, they're the common heritage of humankind. And if it is, then, you know, one nation should not be able to, just because they're have a capacity over another nation, to easily or quickly access these items at the exclusion of the benefits for those other nations. So the Deep Seabed Authority, there's actually the Unclos establishes a special committee to try to regulate how we access and use resources in the area that is not owned by any singular country. And then there's also internal waters. Internal waters are, these are waters lying landward of the mean low water mark. They include bays and other coastal features that extend inland from the normal coastline feature. There's something called a 24-mile semicircle test. The best way to explain this, if you can see this, is to just show you. So, you know, here's the baseline. The baseline is the mean low water mark. And then there are these sort of features, and these features are defined. They can't be any larger than 24 miles, and if they're bigger than 24 miles in a semicircle test in terms of the 24-mile mouth, then they're not considered a bay or an inner portion for this purpose. But if they're smaller than that, and if there's other there's a calculus to be done in terms of the size relative to the mouth. So if they're really big in the size, if it's bigger than the mouth, then there's a problem. But for the most part, these kind of inner areas are also considered internal waters. So they're not part of, the mean low water mark doesn't extend inside here, it stays here, and all of the other zones are identified here. But these little features, these internal waters, are just internal waters of that coastal nation. So those are the general jurisdictional zones under Unclos. And in terms of policy issues, we can think of an example here where we have, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, where we have nations that sit adjacent to one another. And we can think that the nations, as a result, there's a jurisdictional line between them. And these zones under Unclos are still shared between one another. And nation A and nation B, nation A and nation B both have interests in a fishing ground. And this fishing ground is shared in part, this prime fishing ground, not only in the exclusive economic zone of both of these nations, but also in international waters. And there are other nations, we'll call them nation C and nation D, that are interested in this fishing ground. So one of the major issues that we've sort of already discussed or brought up here is that when you have a resource that crosses these boundaries, whether that's boundaries between nations, economic zones, or also into international waters, where any other nation, there could be nation E, F, G, H, where they want to have access, we can run into problems. And the issue is, like I described before, where you can have this sort of Garrett Hardin type tragedy of the commons, where everybody has a vested interest in maximizing the use of that resource. And if they see that others are accessing it, then they might not want to engage in behaviors that they otherwise would, sort of self-restricted behaviors. In other words, they might be pushed to overutilize the resource, even though they know they're doing it, simply because it's a use it or lose it scenario. For those of you that have never had experience, I know you can look it up, but the tragedy of the commons, the historical example of the tragedy of the commons is you have just a sort of a basic common pasture. It's a fixed area of pasture, and any farmer can bring their cows onto the pasture in order to graze. And so farmers regularly do this. And what ends up happening is that, farmer A sees farmer B, C, and D bringing their cows. And, farmer A has one cow, sees the pasture being eaten, but farmer B says, hey, this is great. There's some good grass here. So I'm going to bring another cow. I have one cow, but I'm going to bring my second cow, and then maybe my third. Farmer A sees what farmer B is doing and says, geez, farmer B is bringing 3, 4, 5 cows. They're taking up more and more of the space, and they're eating more and more of the grass, and they're eating the grass at a rate where it can't replenish itself. Hey, you know what? If I just sit here with my one cow, it's very likely that the grass will all be gone, especially if farmer B keeps adding cows. So I better hurry up. Even though I want this to last, when I look at farmer B and I can't exclude farmer B, I don't own this commons, so I can't exclude farmer B from doing what he's doing. And there are no rules to limit the number of cows, right? Farmer B can put as many cows. There's no agreed upon rules. Then I better get my second cow, third cow, fourth cow, because I better feed my cows as much as I can, because this is going to be gone very soon. I don't want it to be gone. I'd love for it to be here for a very long time. But since I see farmer B doing, what he's doing, I have no choice to simply, hurry up and get as much as I can. So that's the race to the bottom, and the bottom is the destruction of the resource. So we've incentivized through our actions each other to go against our better nature or a better thought process. And the main mechanism for that is a lack of agreed upon rules. Most importantly, there's no property right. I mean, that's one problem, is that nobody has unique property rights. But equally important, and this is where Eleanor Ostrom comes in with her common pool resources, her discussion about common pool resources, is that well-defined property rights can be helpful, certainly, but there are also some significant limitations. But when you don't have the opportunity for well-defined property rights, you have rules, and those rules are really important. So in this situation here, what we have is we certainly have well-defined property rights. So if this fishing ground existed only in this area of the exclusive economic zone of nation B, there's no issue. There's no tragedy of the commons, because in this case, nation B is like farmer A, but farmer A can control, because one of the most important rights that you have in private property rights is the right to exclude. So if the fishing ground was only here, then certainly nation B can say nation A, stay away, nation C, stay away, and nation D, stay away, because I have singular access to this economic resource. Of course, I can grant you access, but that's per my decision. And if I don't want to grant you access, then you don't have access. You can see a scenario where nation B might not be technologically advanced, or might simply not choose to put its resources into a fishing industry, but still have fishing ground located solely in its exclusive economic zone. And it might say, hey, neighbor, nation A, you have a well-developed commercial fishing fleet. I will grant you permission to access my fishing ground, if it was located here, as long as you pay me fees for doing so, and then I can redistribute those to my population. And so we both went out. You gain access to a resource you don't have access to. I gain, so there's a scenario where either nation B can access it, can allow nation A, nation C, nation D, all of them under other certain limitations to access. And we see this, by the way, we see where countries have allowed for the development of some of their natural resources, their sovereign national resources, to be undertaken by other countries or companies from other countries, depending on the situation. Because it's it works out for them for whatever reasons, and there can be limitations and problems there too, and perverse incentives and so on and so forth. But in our situation here, where the fishing ground is not located solely within. So actually, before I say that, we can see where Unclos is helpful in establishing these norms. So we say that nation B and nation A are signatories to Unclos. Well, it's great because if they are, then they all agree upon these identified boundaries. You can see a situation where if nation A did not agree upon this boundary and never, said, no, I don't think that you have exclusive rights to 200 miles. So therefore, I think that this is international water, and even if it's located here, I'm going to take advantage of it. Now you have a problem, because you have nation B under the belief that this is my private property effectively, and you have nation A saying, nope, this is not private property, this is like a commons, anybody has access, and so I'm going to access it. Unclos is helpful because it establishes, if they're both signatories, it establishes an agreement that these are the international norms. So therefore, nation B can plan and utilize this resource and protect it as it sees fit. And nation A respects that. And it respects it as a result of it maybe being a signatory, or if it's just a norm, as a norm. But we can also see where complications can arise. So this tells us where these legal frameworks are really important, and they're only as important as everybody agrees to them, of course, because the moment they stop agreeing to them, there's a problem. Now, even if nation A, even if the scenario is like this, you can see the problem where a nation C and nation D, right, are maybe having access and nation A has access. So again, that sort of race to the bottom. But even under this situation, and even though Unclos might not have a solution to the actual who has access to the fishing ground, there may be other scenarios. There may be a bilateral agreement between nation A and nation B about access. There might be a bilateral agreement outside of Unclos, between nation B and nation D about access, where nation B says you do not access this, even though it's here because you agree that this is our fishing, or you limit your access to X amount to ensure the survival of the fishery, et cetera, et cetera. Because, as we mentioned before, without these types of agreements, if they don't exist, then it's difficult for nation B to engage in a situation where, like I said, the United States, for example, to protect the fishery, say the fishery has been overfished historically, they all access it, but nation B says, I'm going to stop fishing. I'm going to prevent our people from fishing this area. I'm going to put a prohibition on fishing in order to allow the stock to rebound. Well, it's no good if the fish just simply move in these directions and nation A, C, and D are taking advantage of the resource and fishing off of the edge effects, effectively just sitting here waiting in their respective jurisdictions for the fish to move over these boundary lines. And so you can see the problems there. We've actually had, I think, Spain and Canada in 1996, where they've literally had some difficulties where they've, effectively acts of what you would call war, where, militaries have been sent out. Canada sending out its military to protect its fishing ground from I think, Spain sitting right here on the edge. Where Canada was trying to limit the amount of fishing, but Spain was sitting here, and Canada said you are in violation, and I think I actually even used its military to tow back Spanish vessels, fishing vessels, which, one of the things you have to understand is a fishing vessel is a flagged vessel, which means it's under the laws of the state in which it's flagged. So let's say that this is Spain, nation C. If it's flying the flag of Spain, even as a commercial fishing vessel, it's under Spanish law and it's a sovereign of Spain, even if it's in international waters. So any act by nation A over the flagged commercial fishing vessel is an act against that nation which it's flagged under international law considerations, other international laws. Another point to that is what's fascinating is that I had mentioned, for example, the United States has protections against marine mammals, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So a United States vessel, a United States flagged commercial vessel, might go into international waters and might want to fish for tuna. One of the best ways to find tuna is to find dolphins. If you find a lot of dolphins, depending on the tuna species, usually they exist where tuna are. So often you search out dolphins, dolphin pods, to find where tuna might exist. And if that tuna are further below the surface, they're both looking for the same type of target fish. The dolphin and the tuna are both looking for the same type of fish. And so one of the difficulties there is historically, we've had situations where, depending on the way in which those tuna are being captured, the dolphin are also being harmed. So if you have a United States flagged vessel that's in international waters and it's fishing for tuna, and there are dolphin proximate to those tuna, it still is under that law, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, even though it's in international waters or it's in the exclusive economic zone because it's allowed to be there of another country. Those laws apply to that commercial fishing vessel, the domestic laws of that fishing vessel. So that's important to know because there are other limitations. There are limitations of each of these nations, their flag nations, based on their own domestic laws about the types of actions they can take. And those nations that have more laws for protections and that sort of thing are limited, whereas other nations, flag nations, commercial vessels that have less laws are less limited. So that's something. Now, of course, this all depends on everybody being a good actor or following their own rules and regulations. Sometimes in your international waters, you don't. Sometimes you purposely fly a different flag. Sometimes you try to be, a commercial vessel of a different flag state where there are no laws so that you can engage in activities that otherwise are prohibited. There's a number of issues that go on. But the point is, for our purposes, just to understand this framework, we can see how these policy issues in terms of a number of things can sort of interact between nations, whether they're adjacent nations or they're other nations, depending on these legal frameworks as they're established. So one of the most fundamental results of Unclos is the establishment of these geospatial boundaries. Those, Unclos provides a standardization of property rights in the ocean. And based on the rules contained in physical boundary definition, signatory nations and non-signatory coastal nations adhering to Unclos rules, like the United States, the respective rights and obligations of coastal nations are defined with some degree of precision. Of course, we can likely see where such rules have room for interpretation, or otherwise contain some ambiguity based on circumstances encountered. Under certain situations, the maritime boundaries are not always easy to determine. For example, consider the situation where two coastal nations share boundaries that overlap with one another. And this is one example. So that's something to consider in trying to understand, better understand sort of the issues of Unclos. In terms of final thoughts, Unclos frameworks create a starting point for international maritime behavior. So we can see how these legal frameworks and these lines create a starting point on how coastal nations adhere themselves to international norms, and they create the norms in many ways, these Unclos frameworks, and therefore then create the expectations on how coastal nations act between each other. And just like in the US, between the coastal states and federal government, property rights help to create foundational frameworks for cooperation. So with those property rights and the acceptance of those property rights, we can start to develop policies, ways of behaving towards one another. If I agree that that's international waters and I agree that that's your exclusive economic zone and you agree that that's my exclusive economic zone, then we can start to say, well, we're respecting each other's boundaries because we have an agreement on those boundaries. And once we have that respect, now we can start thinking about, well, where can we find common space? Are you interested in doing something within my boundaries? Am I interested in doing something within your boundaries? What are those interests? Are we interested in protecting a shared resource that coexists along our boundaries? Can we work together for the protection of that resource? If you're really interested in protecting it, maybe you can incentivize us to be really interested in protecting it by showing us, the information you have, sharing that information, and knowing that you're going to be a good actor, that you're not going to exploit the resource. Maybe that incentivizes us to be a good actor so that we don't have this race to the bottom. You understand, it creates this sort of scenario where once we have these agreed upon rules and we agree to them, then it creates the foundation for cooperation. But those frameworks, even though they do that, they're not guarantees. It's really important to understand that. These frameworks are just that. Because we have sovereignty, coastal state sovereignty, this is not a guarantee of certain behavior. So we must view Unclos in relation to a myriad of international and bilateral agreements. And we must also look to the flag state national laws to determine individual vessel action on the high seas. So if we want to understand, well, what does this mean? What outcomes? We need to know that those outcomes are not definitive, that it's not an easy equation. It's not a 1 and 0. You don't just simply say, well, all we have to do is fill in these blanks and we know exactly what the equation will spit out. And it's always the same because we have so much gray area in terms of, coastal nations, whether they're hard, fast agreements to Unclos and the what Unclos stands for. And then even when we do have those frameworks, they're just that. They're not guarantees of certain actions. So it doesn't mean that a coastal nation will act in any particular way. It doesn't mean that they'll agree to limit their access to resources they otherwise have access to just because another coastal nation is, that sort of thing. So we have to understand that there's a myriad of other issues that, although Unclos provides us with a foundation of frameworks for understanding how to move forward in international accords and international agreements on how we interact in these ocean resources, it does not provide any definitive requirements amongst these nations. So due to the lack of clear consensus and enforcement on high seas, you always have this tragedy of the commons. They're always there, these potential issues, these races to the bottom, and we need to understand that. So as you understand the materials and as you move forward, you say, look, as we move further and further offshore, we have less and less definitive sovereign rights. And because of that, there's going to be a lot more gray area. There's a lot of area for policy development, but that's simply because there's not a lot of hard agreement on what can and cannot be done. So the rules of the road become more ambiguous as we move further offshore. That's simply the truth. And we can expect as a result of that to have sort of a lack of uniform action when it comes to sort of different state actors and how they're taking actions on in international waters. That's it. That's the end. So thank you very much for your time.